Hey you guys, listen, it is a snow day today and I want to go out. But I told myself I wouldn't until I recorded this video. So, this video is going to review the 1920s vocab. In the past, I had a lot more vocab for this unit, so you'll see the stuff that I'm focusing on this time highlighted in yellow. Um, but some of the other ones are important too, so I hope you kind of get the feel for all of it. So I think we've already discussed so many things about the 1920s. It was just this really intense time of change in the United States, probably like within the last 100 years. I would say probably the most dramatic change of any of the other time periods, any of the other decades was the 1920s. Um, so World War One has just finished, and our country has to figure out how to like get back to normal after that. And I don't think that we had had a war of that size or that impact in our country or involving our country since probably the Civil War in the 1800s. So, and we had never fought outside of our country that large of a war before. So once everybody kind of got home and they were getting back to normal, one of the first things that happened is that people had this like major xenophobia. Xeno means other. That prefix means other. So they were really afraid of anybody who wasn't American. Even if they were American, if they weren't like the typical American, if they weren't white, if they weren't like Protestants. So after the war, Europe was just like an absolute wreck. And a lot of people wanted to move to the United States. So immigration shot up really drastically. But the more immigration was happening, the more that Americans were like freaked out by immigration. And a lot of people were also afraid that the United States was going to become communist. So um, that fear of communism is called the Red Scare. So our country in the 1920s, we had this thing called the Red Scare. It was the first Red Scare. It's going to get even worse, especially like in the 1950s and 60s when the Cold War breaks out, where we actually like are more directly competing with Russia to control the world. Um, but we were afraid that we would have a communist revolution like the one in Russia. And just so you guys know, communism is where people, and this is putting it simply, just so you know, but communism basically is where people like share everything. The government owns all the wealth, so there's like really no money. Um, there's no social differences in any way, supposedly. Um, so people are afraid of communists, and they're afraid that anyone who's an immigrant is going to become a communist or is going to be a communist. They're afraid of anarchists. Anarchists believe in no government, and they're afraid of socialists. Socialists want to have the government like kind of control and redistribute some wealth, but it's not as extreme control like communism is. So, as this fear of like communism and like outsiders is growing, the government starts doing these kind of unethical things. I would say they're unethical. Things that we would say kind of violate people's natural rights. So one of them was led by a man named Mitchell Palmer. He started doing these like raids, these surprise raids, on people who were suspected of being radicals, so like communists or anarchists or socialists. And he wouldn't tell them that he was going to like check their businesses or whatever. Um, and so what had prompted this is there had been these bombings that people didn't know who had done it, and most people believe it was done by anarchists, like people who didn't want government, and they were aimed at businesses and government leaders. So um, in those raids, they're called the Palmer raids. They arrested more than 6,000 people who were suspected of being radicals with very little evidence against them, and hundreds of people were deported. So again, it's like kind of going with that fear of immigrants. Demobilization. So the 1920s is a process of demobilization. Mobilize means to get ready to move. So we want to get ready to move. That means we want to undo it. So we were changing from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. And one of problems that happened right away is that when the soldiers returned, a lot of them had a hard time finding their jobs again. Women had gone into the workforce during World War One, and then they were asked to leave and go back home so that men could take over their jobs. And the way that people kind of sold that to them is they told women that that was like their patriotic duty to go back home and take care of their families. Another problem is that during the war, we were selling all this stuff to Europe. And after the war was over, Europe started making its own stuff again and wasn't buying all of our stuff for the war. So our companies temporarily kind of slowed down, and then unemployment is going to rise. And if you guys remember from some of the lectures and stuff like that, um, it ends up kind of reversing as people start buying cars, especially cars are going to really give the economy a big boost. And another thing that happens is that people had like saved all this money during the war, because they couldn't spend it because we were limiting what people could buy because we wanted to send all of our stuff over for the war. So they had like all of this, they were buying everything because they had all this money saved and they didn't know what to do with it. So it's kind of going to mess with prices. Another thing that happened in the 1920s is that so one of the presidents that was in office at the time was Warren G. Harding, and um, he had been involved in some corruption charges. So the Secretary of Interior, his name was Albert Fall, he got caught in something called the Teapot Dome scandal, where he had rented public land to oil company in return for bribes and bonuses. And this is probably one of the first times that people really start to doubt the US government. Up until that point, people kind of trusted the government. They thought the government had their best interest in mind. Um, like I just mentioned earlier, another huge thing that kind of happens during the 20s is that people start buying tons of cars and that it becomes like a car, like everybody has a car in the 1920s. It's going to become more mainstream. So one of the reasons for that is that Henry Ford was able to create the Model T very cheap. I think the first one was like $800. Um, and it was very basic and easy to maintain. He wanted to make it a high quality, cheap car so that even average people could afford to buy them. And then the more that people bought them, the cheaper that they got. So one of the reasons those cars were so cheap is that he used this process called the assembly line. So rather than one person like building the whole car, he had the cars move along like a conveyor belt, and he had like a bunch of workers standing along the edges of the conveyor belt, and each one would do just like one part of the process. So it made it very efficient to get that done. And that style of assembly line manufacturing is going to end up becoming really popular and spreading around the world. And a lot of other companies will copy that, and that will make just overall, all products are going to get a lot cheaper because it's going to be cheaper to make them. Socially, now this is kind of where we're talking about the 1920s changing. Socially, like for women especially, the 1920s were just like this crazy time of change. And one of the most famous, iconic things about the 1920s would be the flappers. So flappers were like a nickname for these women um, who dressed in a really specific way. And one of the reasons they dressed the way they did is they were trying to show that they didn't fit like the norm for people's expectations of women. So flappers were nicknamed flappers because they wore short skirts and they would dance, especially dance to jazz music. And when they would dance, their skirts would flap and make this noise. So they were called flappers. A lot of times they would have short hair, they would smoke and drink, um, and they were kind of trying to challenge this idea that women were like morally pure. They were more like sexualized, I guess, because up until the 1920s, there was this like stereotype about women that women just, I don't know how else to say it, but women didn't care about sex, but women were somehow like better and just like really pure, and the word is chaste. Like they, yeah, like they were more pure than men. They had control over themselves. And flappers were trying to say like, no, women are like men. You know, women can be like anything. And so not just for flappers, like flappers were challenging like the stereotypes about women, but women had been fighting for more rights for a really long time. And when they went to work during the war, that was the first time women started working outside the home to that extent. So because women had helped so much in the war, I think that really helped to get the 19th Amendment passed, which is what gave women the right to vote. And also, like, what's going to come right after that is that prohibition is going to get passed, which I'll be talking about in a second. But women actually had a lot to do with getting prohibition passed. So prohibition, prohibit means to ban. It means to outlaw alcohol. So alcohol was outlawed from 1919 to 1933. That was really difficult to actually enforce, not allowing people to drink alcohol. In fact, it's going to create a lot of crime in our country. But people living in the country tended to be more conservative, and they were the ones who were really supporting prohibition, and the more liberal people living in the cities, flappers, those people were against it. Some people were afraid that prohibition would give the government too much power because the government had to work really hard to enforce prohibition. um, but there was a bunch of different groups that were created to try to fight for prohibition. And one of the most famous ones that actually was really instrumental in getting that passed is called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They said that alcohol leads to crime, poverty, and the breakup of families. So what's kind of not said here, but I just want to point out, is that some of like prohibition was racist. And I know that sounds strange, but um, a lot of the immigration that was happening into the United States was from Eastern and Southern Europe. So places like Italy, Germany a little bit, Austria a little bit, Russia. There's like all these different little tiny Slavic countries. And a lot of them were Catholic, and also there was a stereotype about them that they were heavy drinkers and that they were going to corrupt American society. So that was like some of the excuses used for the xenophobia and people just not liking them. So sometimes some of that like push to ban alcohol was people's reaction against immigration, if that makes sense. So obviously, when you make something illegal, people are still going to try to find a way around it. So people who transported and sold illegal alcohol were called bootleggers, and the reason were called that is that they would try to sneak alcohol in from Canada and Mexico by hiding it in their boots. Like they'd wear these really high boots. The place that alcohol was served illegally was called speakeasies. A lot of times they were hidden. They Sometimes people had to know like passwords or secret locations of these speakeasies, um, and a lot of times they were run by gangsters. And so this is going to lead to the rise of organized crime because it's going to be gangsters who become really powerful because they're the ones who are willing to sell alcohol. So alcohol is going to be made legal again from the 21st Amendment, which is passed in December 5th of 1933. And the reason that actually the 21st Amendment ends up getting passed and prohibition is reversed is that it was too hard to enforce that law. Not necessarily that people didn't support that law anymore, but that it was too hard to enforce. And gangsters were becoming really, really powerful because of it, and people didn't want to see that continuing to happen. Okay, so besides like the alcohol thing, there's going to be this another clash between like traditional views and conservative views and more radical and liberal views. So up until like 1920s, Most people in the United States would say that they were Christian as long as they were like born in the United States. Sometimes you'd have like a few people who wouldn't say they were, but the majority of people would say they were Christian. So even up until that point, like the Bible was heavily taught in schools. People prayed in schools. When they would talk about like how the world was created, they would say that the world was created in 7 days by God. So just like people's views on women and things like that were changing, people's views on the Bible were also changing, and science. So one of those big conflicts comes to light in Tennessee when a man named John Scopes tried to teach evolution in school. He did it on purpose, knowing it was illegal because he wanted to be arrested. He wanted his trial to go to court, and it ends up getting passed to the Supreme Court. And it makes fundamentalist Christians really angry because they believe that the Bible is the literal truth, which we'll talk about that in a second. But he is going to be prosecuted. This is a super famous case. He's going to be prosecuted by a man named William Jennings Bryant. Um, and he's actually convicted. And it's going to start the debate in politics about religious beliefs because, I mean, traditionally in American society, there's this separation between church and state, but still, up until that point, the American government kind of advocated Christianity and still publicly stood by Christianity. But this is going to kind of enforce that separation a bit more. So, like I said, there was like anytime you have people making like radical changes, you have this like growth of people trying to stop those changes. And we would say when you want to keep something the same as it always has been, that's conservatism or traditionalism. Liberalism is wanting change or development quick. So, as people start to challenge the Bible and teach science, it gives rise to this movement called fundamentalism. So, fundamentalism usually has like a bad connotation, but really what it means is that somebody just believes literally that their religion is true, that everything about their religion is true. So, it's not necessarily like a negative thing, but it's sometimes used negatively when people are trying to say that someone's being inflexible. So some people started questioning that the Bible was literally true. Some people thought, like modernists thought that you shouldn't treat the Bible like it was literal, but that maybe it was more like poetry or interpretation. But so, for example, the idea that God made the world in 7 days. Some people believe, like, even people that believe the Bible is true, they would say, well, maybe when they said 7 days, they really mean like 7 million years because like one day to God is like a million years to people. So, um, stuff like that. This idea of fundamentalism becomes really important in the Scopes trial. I think you probably have already heard the term the Great Migration because this was a big deal during World War One, but it's the movement of African Americans to the north. And during World War One, over 500,000 African Americans moved from the south to the north to find better jobs and social opportunities. They wanted to escape something known as Jim Crow laws in the South, and they also wanted to get out of like sharecropping and things like that. I know we haven't talked about that a lot, but essentially there was like these separate laws for African Americans than for white people in the South. They were called Jim Crow laws. So it was like things like segregated schools, things like segregated public spaces were part of Jim Crow. Things like black people and white people couldn't be seen together out in public. There's a lot of weird stuff. Even I'm trying to remember some more of them. Like there was some strange laws. Like if an African American is caught without a job, he or she could be required to serve like several years forced labor without pay, slavery, in other words. So yeah, things in the South were really bad up until the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, still in some places they're bad, but the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s really challenges that. But we haven't had that big challenge yet. So So yeah, so people are going to move north, trying to escape that racism. But as they move, like I told you, whenever you have like a a big change or a challenge to something, you have people kind of freak out and resist it. So as people move north, it caused a lot of people in the north to become, well, I don't know if it become, but it revealed a lot of racism in the north because people freaked out that all these African Americans were coming and they were afraid for their jobs, things like that. Um, in the 1920s, radio was becoming super popular. Printed media is going to become really popular, and it's going to create these things called fads. It's kind of like a trend, right? So it's a popular thing that lasts a short time. But there's some really strange things in the 1920s that came out as fads, like self-help programs, crossword puzzles were like 1920s fads. Miniature golf, mahjong, which is like a Chinese board game, and all of it was spread through mass media. So mass media is anything that can spread the same message to a really big audience. And so for the first time in American history, everybody's getting like advertised to with the same product. So it's going to create what we call a mass culture where everybody's like more similar. Like we all like Americans were all kind of buying the same stuff, or at least wanting the same stuff, things like that. Nickelodeons were also super popular during the 1920s. It's just a nickname for the early movie theaters because they usually cost 5 cents. Thomas Edison had invented the motion pictures, and so those films were silent until 1927, where talkies were invented. They were a popular form of entertainment because everybody could afford to go to them. Um, so up until the talkies were created, like it was pretty cool because if you went to see the movies, you would have a live orchestra playing while you listened. Okay, so I just want to show you the questions for this unit just so you can have a glimpse at them. I'm sure that I will post them somewhere, but let me zoom in a little bit. Okay, so what happened in the U.S. so that the country could go back to normal after World War One? Let's just glimpse. I've got some notes that might fit that. Just to review, we had to demobilize, so we had to go from that wartime economy to the peacetime. At first, we lost our sales from Europe from the war. It was hard for veterans to find jobs. Women were asked to go home and give up their jobs. There was a recession at first. Unions began to strike. It caused a lot of like fear. What was the Red Scare? The Red Scare, so I'm on the second one here. And what caused it? The Red Scare was a widespread panic that political radicals would cause a revolution in the United States, similar to one in Russia. People were especially afraid of communists, socialists, and anarchists. This fear went along with people's xenophobia and racism toward Eastern and Southern Europeans who were suspected of being communists. People's fears increased in 1919 when someone began sending bombs to businesses and government leaders. Mitchell Palmer began conducting raids against suspected communists and other political radicals. Thousands were arrested and hundreds were deported without evidence and without due warrants or fair trials. All right. What was happening in the US economy following World War One? I think we already kind of mentioned that. We were transitioning to that peacetime economy. We had to restore that economy to balance after we lost our sales to Europeans, who was getting the jobs. You can also mention that we um, created credit, so people are going to be able to buy more stuff on credit because they're going to have access to credit, which is going to stimulate the economy. Mass media will help convince people to buy things they can't afford. Using installment plans, we create a consumer society where people are always buying the latest stuff. And not everybody is going to be having equal growth in their economics. Even though our economy was thriving by the mid 1920s and people were investing in the stock market, not everybody has equal shares of those profits. Like Unskilled workers often didn't make as much money, but were still being pressured to buy more through mass media advertising and buying on installments. Um, Farmers are going to struggle after the war when food prices dropped and they had already overproduced their food. Okay, so next question. What led to prohibition in the United States and what impact did it have? Okay, it was caused by a moral opposition to drinking. Rural people were more traditional and feared that alcohol created criminals out of otherwise ordinary people. Women used their new right to vote to push for prohibition. The Anti Saloon League was formed in 1893, and the Christian Temperance Union pushed for the banning of alcohol. Okay, wait, did I miss a part? What impact did it have? Okay, so and by the way, don't forget it was 1917 to 1933 that happened. Okay, and what effect did it have? The effect is that gangsters became powerful as they opened speakeasies and bought and sold liquor from bootleggers. They used blackmail and bribery. It was really difficult to enforce that law. I think that's the major stuff. You might even mention flappers, like um, that. Even though like drinking was illegal, it was part of like the flappers' identity to be to drink. Okay. What was the conflict between religion and science in the 1920s? I think I would highlight um, that it was like fundamentalism versus liberalism. So you could talk about how like fundamentalists were believing that the Bible was literally true and should be the authority in all people's lives, but some people and they didn't trust like the modern industry and science. So like as people are seeing things change, they want to hold on to those traditional values. However, more people began to believe in Darwin's theory of evolution, and those people are going to be challenging fundamentalists. In many states, it was illegal to teach evolution until John Scopes um, challenges that law, and then the Scopes trial happens. He was found guilty, but later that's going to be overturned. So yeah, you can talk about Scopes. You can talk about that challenge between liberalism or modernism and fundamentalism. Okay, what else? What was happening in the lives of minorities and women in the 1920s? So there's so many things you can talk about. The Great Migration, where African Americans are moving north. You can talk about women. You can talk about flappers and women getting the right to vote. Women being asked to return home after World War One. You can talk about women leading like the fight to get prohibition. You can talk about, I don't know what my lecture talked about, but there was like a growth of the KKK in the 1920s because people are freaked out by like all the immigration, and there's this nativism and xenophobia people are struggling with. Um, you can also mention the Red Scare in there, that as the immigration was increasing, the Red Scare showed that people were afraid of communism and radicalism. Um, yeah, I think that's the main thing. What happened during the Harlem Renaissance? You might want to talk about like what Renaissance means. That Renaissance means rebirth, but it was the rebirth of African American culture during the 1920s. Let's see if I can move this thing. Oops, I'm doing so many crazy things. Okay. Um, During the 1920s in Harlem, there was this explosion of African American art, poetry, and music. Jazz becomes popular all over the United States. You can talk about some of the famous artists like Langston Hughes and Louis Armstrong, um, who are encouraging African Americans to be proud of their heritage and to express it using art. I think just making sure that you mention something about art and music and how it was combined with showcasing basically African American identity and just pride, that African Americans should be proud of who they are. Okay, And then the last one is, why are the 1920s nicknamed the Jazz Age in the United States? I think you would probably just talk about the fact that jazz is going to be really a big deal in the 1920s. You could mention some of those famous artists like Louis Armstrong. Who else was in there? Duke Ellington. I think Dizzy Gillespie might have been part of the 1920s jazz. But jazz becomes mainstream for the first time. So, for the first time in American history, African black music is going to become popular and mainstream, not just with African Americans. And that's going to be a huge deal because it shows that white people are appreciating African culture and Africans. In fact, at the time, if you wanted to play jazz and get paid for it at a club, um, you had a lot of times, like even white musicians, which were not preferred, if they were getting hired, they had to go in blackface. So they'd paint their face black because people believe that only African Americans could play jazz correctly. They're probably not wrong. Um, what else? You might even mention that jazz kind of goes along with the drinking culture of the 1920s, even though prohibition made alcohol illegal. In a lot of those speakeasies, they would use, like, the speakeasies would have jazz. So jazz kind of also became this symbol of like rebellion. People are afraid that white girls would fall in love with black jazz musicians, which, I mean, again, who could blame them? So I think that's a good summary of the 1920s. I hope that helped you study for your test.